A billionaire walked into his own restaurant disguised as a poor man. What he discovered that night wasn't just corruption. It was a secret that had already taken a life and would cost him his soul to expose. This is the story of the note beneath the plate, a story of truth, sacrifice, and redemption. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow's story will hit even deeper. The rain in San Francisco came down in slow, heavy sheets, blurring the lights of the bay until the skyline looked like a watercolor left too long in the water. Ethan Cole sat behind the wheel of a dented pickup truck, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. The man who looked back at him bore little resemblance to the billionaire who once graced the covers of Forbes and the Financial Times. His tailored suits were gone, replaced by a faded work jacket and a grease-stained flannel. His hair, usually neat and precise, was longer now, pushed back messily beneath a worn baseball cap. His face carried the kind of stillness only grief could carve. It had been 5 years since the night his wife, Sarah, collapsed over dinner at the Monarch table, one of his own restaurants. The autopsy called it foodborne illness. The investigators closed the file in 3 weeks, but Ethan had watched her die with his own eyes, and something about that night never sat right. He'd built an empire of perfection, luxury hotels, world-class dining, immaculate service. And yet, behind the polished smiles and 5-star ratings, he could feel rot spreading. He just didn't know where. Tonight, he intended to find out. He turned off the ignition and stepped out into the rain, pulling the brim of his cap low. The street gleamed with puddles that reflected the glow of the restaurant's golden logo, the Monarch table. Even through the storm, the place exuded elegance. Marble pillars, brass doors, and warm amber light spilling from the windows. It was his pride and his shame in equal measure. Inside, laughter and the clinking of wine glasses filled the air. Patrons in designer suits dined beneath crystal chandeliers. The staff moved like dancers, precise, rehearsed, emotionless. Ethan took a breath and opened the heavy glass door. The hostess, a tall woman in her early 30s, with a diamond brooch on her lapel, glanced at him and hesitated. He could read her expression instantly. "You don't belong here." She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Good evening, sir. Do you have a reservation?" "No," Ethan said. His voice was deeper than usual, roughened deliberately. "Just one, if you can fit me in." Her eyes flicked down to his boots, still wet from the rain, then to his frayed jacket. She hesitated just long enough to make sure he noticed the pause. "Let me see what we can do," she said, her tone crisp as glass. After tapping her tablet, she added, "We have a small table available, near the kitchen entrance." "That'll do," he said quietly. She led him past rows of perfectly dressed guests who tried not to stare, though many did. Some looked away with polite discomfort, others with thinly veiled contempt. Ethan caught his reflection in the mirrored wall, a stranger among kings. Good, he thought. Let them think I don't belong. The hostess stopped at a cramped 2-seater table near swinging doors that led to the kitchen. Every time the doors opened, heat and noise poured out. The clang of pans, the hiss of oil, the sharp voices of line cooks. It was the worst table in the room. Perfect. "Will this be all right?" she asked, her tone heavy with irony. "More than all right," Ethan said, and she blinked, confused by his calm. He sat down and took in the room. The smell of truffle oil and seared beef mixed with the faint scent of bleach from the kitchen. Music played softly from hidden speakers. An expensive jazz track meant to sound effortless. He'd approved this playlist himself years ago. Now it felt artificial, lifeless. Minutes passed before a waitress appeared at his side. She was young, mid-20s maybe, with chestnut hair tied back in a simple bun. Her uniform wasn't perfectly crisp like the others. The collar was slightly frayed, and the white apron had faint stains near the hem. But what caught Ethan's attention were her eyes, large, brown, and tired in a way that came from life, not work. They carried the kind of sorrow you couldn't fake. "Good evening," she said softly. "My name's Grace. I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I get you something to drink?" Ethan studied her face for a moment longer than was polite. "Just water for now," he said finally. "Of course." She smiled, small, genuine, and disappeared into the kitchen. He watched her move. She didn't glide like the others. She hurried, careful not to be seen, her shoulders slightly hunched as if she was trying to make herself smaller. Twice he noticed the restaurant manager, Patrick Lane, glance sharply in her direction. Patrick was tall, with slicked back hair and the self-satisfied posture of a man who'd learned that fear was an effective management tool. He whispered something to a waiter, who nodded and rushed toward the kitchen. When Grace returned with his water, her hand trembled slightly as she set it down. "Are you ready to order?" "Not yet," he said. "I'm still deciding." She nodded and turned to leave, but Ethan caught her hesitation, a flicker of unease, like she wanted to say something but couldn't. Then she vanished again into the noise of the kitchen. Ethan leaned back, pretending to study the menu. Every dish, every word was his. He'd written those descriptions years ago to sell comfort, to sell trust. Grass-fed beef from Northern California, farm-to-table produce sourced locally. But the words meant nothing if the hands behind them were dirty. When Grace returned, he closed the menu. "I'll have the imperial ribeye," he said, his tone even. "Medium rare." Her eyes widened slightly. "The imperial ribeye?" she repeated as if to confirm. "Yes." He didn't look away. "And a glass of Chateau Margaux, 2005. For a moment she froze. The steak was nearly $500. The wine, $2,500 a bottle. Guess who looked like Ethan Turner didn't order those things? They ordered burgers and cheap beer. She blinked rapidly, caught between professionalism and disbelief. "Of course," she said quietly, recovering her composure. "Right away." As she walked off, Ethan could feel Patrick's eyes on him. The manager was leaning on the bar, watching like a hawk. He whispered something to another waiter and strode toward the kitchen. Through the small window in the swinging door, Ethan glimpsed him cornering Grace near the service station. Patrick's gestures were sharp, aggressive. Grace shook her head, murmuring something, but Patrick's voice rose, cutting through the din of the kitchen. A few other staff members pretended not to see. Ethan clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay seated. This was why he'd come, to see the truth without the filter of his money. And the truth, he realized, was ugly. When Grace returned, her face was pale. She set down his glass of wine with careful precision, as though afraid it might shatter between her fingers. "Everything all right?" Ethan asked quietly. "Yes," she said too quickly. "Would you like anything else?" He hesitated. "What's your name again?" She looked up, startled. "Grace. Grace Miller." He nodded. "Grace suits you." For the first time that night, her lips curved into something resembling a real smile. It was faint, fleeting, but real. Then she left again, and Ethan felt an ache he couldn't name. The meal took nearly an hour. He ate slowly, deliberately, watching the room. The wealthy guests, the forced laughter, the perfect lies. He thought about Sarah, how she used to tease him for building a world that looked flawless but felt hollow. "You can polish silver until it blinds you," she once said, "but it'll never reflect what's real." When the dessert menu came, he declined. "Just the check," he told Grace. She nodded and left. He waited, tracing the rim of his glass, thinking he'd seen everything he needed to see. The arrogance, the hierarchy, the fear. Then Grace returned. She placed the bill in front of him and walked away quickly, almost too quickly. Ethan opened the leather folder. The receipt was there, and beneath it, folded neatly in half, a white linen napkin. He frowned and lifted it. 5 words written in hurried, slanted script bled faintly through the fabric. "They're poisoning the supply chain." He read it twice, 3 times. The letters trembled slightly as if written by a shaking hand. His pulse quickened. It wasn't just corruption or theft. It was something darker, something deadly. Ethan folded the napkin back up, slipped it into his jacket pocket and stood. As he walked toward the exit, he glanced once toward the kitchen. Grace stood near the door, her hands clasped tightly in front of her apron. Their eyes met. She didn't smile this time. She only mouthed one word, "Please." Outside, the rain had stopped, but the air felt heavier than before. Ethan paused under the awning, staring at the napkin in his hand. It felt like a fuse, small, fragile, but ready to ignite an empire. He looked up at the glowing sign above the door, the name he'd built his fortune on, the Monarch Table. For the first time, it looked less like a restaurant and more like a tomb, and he knew, with absolute certainty, that whatever this note meant, it wasn't over. It was only beginning. The morning after the rain smelled of salt and diesel from the bay, Ethan Cole hadn't slept. The white napkin sat on the marble counter of his penthouse like a crime scene exhibit, 5 words scrawled in panic, now dry but still heavy with consequence. They're poisoning the supply chain. He'd read them a dozen times through the night, each reading cutting a little deeper. By dawn, he was on the phone. "Marcus," he said when the line clicked. The voice on the other end was groggy but alert. "It's 6 a.m., Ethan. I know. We've got a problem at the Monarch Table. I need you to dig into the manager Patrick Lane, quietly, and find me everything you can about a waitress named Grace Miller." There was a pause. What happened? Ethan hesitated, glancing at the napkin again. "Someone risked their job to write me this. She said they're poisoning the supply chain." Marcus exhaled. "That's serious. You think it's legit?" "I think someone died once because I trusted the wrong people." His voice was flat. "I'm not letting it happen again." Grace Miller's alarm buzzed at 8 a.m., though she'd been awake for hours. Sleep had become a stranger long ago. The motel room smelled faintly of bleach and cheap air freshener, the carpet worn thin under her bare feet. She dressed quietly, trying not to wake her sister Lily, who lay curled on the bed beside an oxygen concentrator that hummed softly. The girl's thin arms were littered with bruises from IV lines, her lips pale but peaceful in sleep. Grace brushed a strand of hair from Lily's face. "I'll be back before noon," she whispered. "I'll pick up the new medication on the way." She forced a smile that only made her feel emptier, then slipped out into the morning fog. The bus ride downtown was long and quiet, filled with strangers, too tired to speak. She clutched her phone, scrolling through messages from Patrick Lane. "You're late on the report again. Don't forget who saved your job. We'll talk tonight. Don't make me come find you." Each message hit like a bruise. 2 years ago, Grace had been a bookkeeping student at City College. She dropped out when Lily's diagnosis came, severe aplastic anemia. The hospital bills had swallowed everything their mother left behind. The job at the Monarch Table was supposed to be temporary. Then came Patrick. He was charming at first, helpful even. When she made a small mistake in a delivery invoice, he'd covered for her. Later, she discovered he'd used that mistake to fabricate a false report, one that claimed she'd approved a shipment that never arrived. He demanded repayment for the loss. $7,000, impossible money. Now she worked under his terms. He took part of her tips for restitution, made her sign off on invoices she knew were forged, and threatened to blacklist her from every reputable restaurant if she spoke. Last night, she'd snapped. The man at table 19, the quiet one in the worn jacket, hadn't looked like anyone important, but his calm eyes and steady tone made something stir in her. She saw kindness there, and something rarer, attention. Real attention. So she took the biggest risk of her life and wrote the truth on that napkin. Now the fear was settling in. At the Cole Group headquarters, Marcus Hall worked with the efficiency of someone who'd once lived by rules of surveillance and silence. His office was dark except for the glow of 3 monitors. Background checks, employment files, social media traces, he pulled them like threads from an invisible web. Patrick Lane, 38 years old, former operations manager at 2 luxury chains. Fired once for accounting discrepancies, rehired under a different alias 6 months later. Bank accounts linked to offshore companies registered in Nevada and Belize. Grace Miller, 26, no criminal record. High GPA before dropping out of college. Responsible for one dependent, Lily Miller, 12 years old. Hospital records confirm rare blood disease. Income, below subsistence. Debt, staggering. Marcus frowned. The pattern was too clean. Patrick wasn't just corrupt, he was protected. He dialed Ethan. "You're right, something's rotten. Lane's connected to a supplier called Westfield Meats. Shut down 2 years ago for bacterial contamination, but somehow they're back under a new name." "Westfield," Ethan repeated. He remembered the reports from the year Sarah died. That was the same supplier used by the Monarch table. Grace was right, Marcus said grimly. They're feeding people poison, Ethan. Ethan didn't answer right away. He stared out his window where the fog had begun to lift over the Golden Gate. Find out where the deliveries come in, he said. Tonight I'm going back. By evening, Grace's shift had already turned sour. Patrick was in one of his mood-snapping orders, throwing menus, sneering at staff. The whispers about the weird man from the night before had spread. Patrick had checked the security footage. He'd seen her near the table. He'd seen the napkin. Grace, he called sharply as she walked past with a tray. Come here. Her heart lurched. She set the tray down and approached. Yes, Mr. Lane? He smiled thinly. You've been with us, what, 2 years? Yes, sir. You like your job? I do. Good, he said, stepping closer. His cologne was sharp, suffocating. Then you'll stop doing stupid things. Understand? Her stomach turned. I'm not sure He slammed his hand against the counter. The kitchen went silent. Don't play dumb with me. You gave that man something. What was it? Grace's throat went dry. A receipt, she lied. Patrick's eyes hardened. Try again. She shook her head. That's all. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a hiss. If I ever find out you're lying, it won't just be your job you lose. You've got a sister, right? Lily? The name hit like a slap. How do you... I know everything about my staff, he said. Remember that. Then he straightened his tie and walked away, leaving her trembling beside the counter. That night, Ethan parked a few blocks from the Monarch table and waited. The rain had returned, softer now, misting the windshield. Marcus sat in the passenger seat, tapping on his tablet. Deliveries come in through the back alley around 3 a.m., he said. 2 trucks. They're registered to Golden Provisions, which doesn't exist. Ethan adjusted his cap. We'll go in at midnight. You sure about this? Marcus asked. You're not just an owner walking into his own building. You're walking into a criminal network that might be tied to Sarah's death. Ethan's jaw tightened. Then it's long past due. The plan was simple. They'd enter through the service door as cleaners from a contracted company. Marcus had already added their names to the roster. Once inside, Ethan would search Patrick's office for invoices and ledgers. If the napkin was true, the evidence would be there. But simplicity is a fragile thing. Inside the restaurant, Patrick was pacing. He'd spent the evening drinking in his office, trying to calm the pulse that thudded behind his eyes. That napkin, he couldn't stop thinking about it. The handwriting had been small, feminine. He knew who it was. He just couldn't prove it yet. He unlocked the safe under his desk and stared at the folder inside. Its pages marked Westfield supply agreements. The signatures, the dates, the hidden payment codes. It was enough to ruin him if they ever saw daylight. A knock on the door. Come in, he barked. Grace stepped in, pale, trembling. You asked for me. Patrick smiled slowly. Yes. Sit down. She didn't move. Relax, he said. You're not in trouble, not yet. Her heart hammered. Then why? He tossed the napkin onto the desk. Recognize this? Her breath caught. The room tilted. I found it in the trash, he lied smoothly. Funny thing, though, security footage shows you serving the man who left around that time. The same one who paid cash. No card, no name. Grace's lips parted, but no sound came out. Patrick leaned back. You've been very helpful to me these past 2 years. I'd hate to think you're planning to be less helpful. He slid open a drawer and took out his phone. On the screen was a photo of Lily, taken outside their motel, walking home from school. Grace's knees nearly gave way. Please, she whispered. Don't. That depends, Patrick said, on whether you can still be useful. At that exact hour across town, Marcus watched Ethan load a small recording device into his jacket. If this goes bad, we walk, Marcus warned. Ethan shook his head. No. If this goes bad, we find out why. As the city fell into darkness, the lights of the Monarch table gleamed like gold, deceptive, inviting. Inside those walls, 2 people were fighting very different battles, one for the truth, the other just to survive. Neither knew that before the night was over, both would cross a line they could never return from. Midnight had a different color in the back alleys of the city, a washed-out cobalt, broken by sodium street lamps and the occasional blink of a delivery van. Ethan and Marcus moved like ghosts between dumpsters and stacked pallets. The names Marcus had forged for them, waiting in a trash-strewn folder on the passenger seat. Cleanworks Night Shift, Turner and Hall. Marcus clicked his flashlight off and tapped the earpiece clipped to Ethan's collar. "We're live in 30, he whispered. "Front desk thinks you're scheduled. The system will show 2 new cleaners added at midnight. Security's been looped with a maintenance request from our vendor." Ethan's hands were steady despite the thunder that rolled in his chest. He had done things before that required scale and strategy, hostile takeovers, crisis PR, decisions that moved markets. None of that had prepared him for the brittle sensation of slipping under fluorescent kitchen lights with a mop bucket and a false badge. Tonight he was not the man who could buy silence. He was a novice at being small. They scuffed the utility door and presented their forged IDs to the night manager, a tired-faced woman with a headset and a bored efficiency. Her scanner beeped, the lock clicked, and the pair were inside, swallowed at once by the humid heat of the kitchen and its wet chorus of steel and steam. The aroma of garlic and rendered fat wrapped around them like a second skin. A pair of line cooks glanced up and then returned to their sauté pans, unconcerned. The whole restaurant had closed hours ago, but the kitchen kept warm for prep crews and late-night cleaning. "Remember protocol," Marcus murmured as they ducked out of view. "If the cameras ping, we're supposed to be the cleaners. That's our alibi." He moved with practiced efficiency, padding down to the basement corridor where supplies and accounting archives lived between stacks of canned tomatoes and an industrial freezer. Ethan's job was smaller than any deal he'd ever orchestrated. Get into Patrick Lane's office, find the ledgers and any digital drives, copy what mattered, and get out. In his pocket, the napkin burned like an accusation, and his memory replayed Grace's twitch of fear when Patrick had shown her the photo. He had to make sure fear like that had an answer. They reached the lockbox that had been identified in floor plans, a steel door marked Admin, Authorized Personnel Only. Marcus bypassed the keypad with a device that whispered and chirped, a small orchestra of electronic deceit. The door sighed open. Inside, the air turned cooler. Filing cabinets lined the walls and rows of binders stood like mute witnesses. A desk lamp threw an oval of amber, and in that oasis of light sat Patrick Lane's black leather chair, and the desk with its personal artifacts, a framed photograph of a golf tournament, a city council commendation, a crystal paperweight. "Check for safes," Marcus said in a stage whisper. "There's usually a hidden compartment under the false bottom of that shelf." He moved with the nimbleness of a man who had cracked many doors in his life, and his fingers found the seam right where the shelf met the wall. A panel popped free. Behind it, a small safe was bolted into studs. Ethan's breath fogged in the lamplight. The safe's keypad had digits that still glowed faintly from use. Marcus smiled grimly. This is where ego keeps its secrets. He worked with tools that twined like a key into the lock's inner anatomy. It took only a few minutes, a lifetime measured in the ticking of an unseen clock, before the lock surrendered with a soft, final click. Inside, a stack of envelopes tied with a rubber band, a ledger with smudged handwriting, a leather-bound notebook with a pen still tucked into its spine, and a small external hard drive labeled in a careless hand. Westfield Files, Conf. Ethan's fingers closed around it. The leather was slick with someone else's hands. He felt suddenly as if he were touching a wound. "Copy everything," Marcus said. "We can't assume paper survives a sweep. Get the hard drive, the ledger, scan the folder snap photos, everything." Marcus pulled a pocket-sized forensic imager from his bag and set to work, its tiny green light humming while data streamed into its memory. Ethan snapped photos, his hands steady now with purpose. The ledger contained invoices marked with a coded supplier name. Westfield, 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 traced to shell companies and accounts that fed into a shadow network. The notebook contained shorthand notes, dates, times, payment codes, and brief initials. There were phrases that sat like splinters beneath the ink. Reduce temp, expedite crate, lab clear, and then chillingly, sanitize trace, burn logs. He photographed every page and stuffed a sheaf into his jacket. The hard drive clicked once as Marcus attached it to his jumper and began a silent copy. The green light blossomed. The progress bar crawled. "We need this backed up twice," Marcus said. "If this is what we think, if Westfield is back in play, this is the smoking gun." A distant drone, the hum of a compressor somewhere deeper in the restaurant, masked the sound of footsteps. Ethan froze. Marcus stopped mid-tap, eyes narrowing. "We're not alone," he whispered. A camera in the corner blinked lazily, one of the many feeds the proper security guard would check in the morning. Marcus's fingers flew faster, snatching every bite he could while he could. Then came the unmistakable clack of keys in a lock. A figure at the far end of the hall appeared in the doorway's halo. Patrick Lane, his silhouette blunt and dangerous, flanked by two men whose shoulders were the kind that wore uniforms like armor. They were earlier than expected. Ethan's heart knocked, a hard animal against his ribs. Patrick's voice carried down the corridor. "Check the basement. Make sure the night crew is doing their rounds." He moved like a man made of control, the cheap cologne now smelling like arrogance and oil. The two guards spread out behind him, their hands resting on the belts where flashlights and radios lived. Marcus froze behind a stack of boxed linens. Ethan felt the full weight of risk like a tide pulling at him. He could try to walk out, badge in hand, act the cleaner and let Patrick's men pass. But the safe was open. The hard drive was in Marcus's hand. The ledger was in Ethan's jacket. There was no graceful exit now, only a split-second decision. "Back door," Marcus mouthed. "We can make it to the freezer, then out through the loading dock. 2 minutes." His voice was worn, the old agent calm, now a thing of brittle glass. Ethan nodded, and they slipped like water, low and silent, toward the kitchen. But fate and steel conspired. A swinging door banged open, and a sous chef stumbled, a tray clattering. An accident, a small betrayal of the night. Patrick's head snapped toward the noise, and the three men began to converge. The corridor narrowed. The freezer door loomed like a cliff. "Move!" Marcus hissed. They bolted. The guard nearest to them hauled a radio to his mouth. "Someone in the basement! Security breach!" His words were a line thrown into a pool. Ripples spread. One of the guards lunged for Ethan, fingers finding the collar of his fake uniform. Ethan twisted, knocking the man's grip aside and shoving him into a stack of crates. The man recovered with a grunt and drew a baton and a flash of rubber and metal. Marcus pushed Ethan toward the freezer and forced the heavy latch. The freezer's cold breath was a slap after the kitchen's heat. Frost gathered on Ethan's coat hem. Marcus jammed a padded crate under the latch to keep it sealed and shoved Ethan behind a rack of frozen stock. "Stay," he mouthed, and bolted back out to create a diversion. The freezer doors banged as voices closed in, boots thudding above them. Sound swallowed them. The hum of the compressor encircled like a throat. Ethan crouched, his breath steadying in the cold. The hard drive's weight now a hot coal in the bag at his chest. He could hear Patrick's voice, low and furious, demanding answers, threats like promises. A sharp crash resounded from the corridor. Marcus had collided with a guard and sent a cart of pans skittering into a pile against the wall. A commotion, shouts. Someone swore. Metal clanged. The diversion worked, for a heartbeat. Then a different sound cut across the chaos. Soft, strangled, a tiny choked sound that made Ethan's stomach drop. It was human and broken. Grace. Ethan tore from his hiding place and peered through the freezer's frosted glass. He saw her then, half dragged, one arm twisted behind her back, eyes wide with tears and fear. Two large figures held her like prey. Patrick stood over her, his face a flat mask of triumph. He leaned in, and Ethan could see the way he talked, words too low to catch, but the motion of his lips showed intent. He reached out to a guard and shoved a small slip of paper toward him. The guard smirked and pocketed it like currency. Grace's mouth moved. She must have been pleading. Ethan bleated silently with impotent rage and the kind of terror that could harden into a blade. He banged his shoulder against the freezer door. His shout was a raw thing, incandescent. "Hey!" Marcus's voice was a hammer. "Hands off! Let her go!" He barreled from behind the stack of crates and tackled one of the guards. A crash of bodies, a flare of motion. The two men grappled, The guard's baton cracked against Marcus's forearm. Marcus swung, a practiced, brutal arc that found flesh. The other guard lashed out and landed a blow across Marcus's cheek. Marcus stumbled, blood instant from his lip, but the fight opened a small corridor. Ethan lunged. He was not trained to fight. He had trained people to fight battles of money and influence, not of flesh. Still, he moved with a single-mindedness that would have been comic if it weren't so desperate. He shoved one guard into a stack of boxes, elbowing and grabbing for Grace's arm. She was smaller than he expected, bone and tremor. Her eyes met his, and a flash of something like recognition passed. Then horror. "You shouldn't have come back," Patrick snarled, his silhouette hard as a nail. He swung a heavy object, a steel ladle that gleamed bloodless in the heat, and struck Marcus with it. Marcus crumpled, shock blooming across his face like a mask cracking. The ladle struck again, and Marcus went down, knocked senseless amid overturned crates. Ethan's world narrowed. He dragged Grace toward the freezer, her small frame limp in his arms, then felt the sharp pain of a blow across his ribs. A guard's hand had landed with the force of a club. He saw Patrick's face, and then the room rolled into furnace-hot edges of sound. Someone cursing, someone shouting for security, and the thud of bodies. He made it to the freezer and shoved Grace inside, collapsing the door behind them with a fury born of fear. The world closed to a thin, cold corridor of compressed air and the hum of the compressor. For a moment he thought with wild, childish hope that they had made it. He looked down at Grace. Blood specked the sleeve of her blouse. Her breathing was shallow, a whisper that barely moved the white of her throat. "Ethan," she breathed, and her voice was a rasp, smaller than the kitchen's echo. She clutched at his jacket like a drowning person at a rope. "You have—" She mouthed the words and he leaned in. Her lips trembled. "Save Lily." She tried to hand him something small and folded, a folded scrap of paper, and then her hand fell limp. Ethan tore his phone out with shaking fingers and turned on the flashlight, but the light only made the cold look bluer. The scrap of paper lay in Grace's palm, damp with blood, the ink smudged but not unreadable. He fumbled it free and opened it. A sequence of digits. A birth date, he realized, and beneath it one word. Server. Her login. Her voice had been barely audible, but the meaning was crystalline. She had passed him the key she used to access the restaurant's internal files. She had tried to give them a lifeline. "Grace," Ethan said, the word a jagged thing in his throat. She coughed, convulsed once, and then, impossibly, smiled a tiny, terrible smile. "It's okay," she whispered. "Lily, please, keep her alive." He could not promise her in that moment the things he could do with his millions. Instead, he promised the one thing that wasn't permission or contract. "I will," he said, and the words tasted like iron. Above them, boots pounded and Patrick's voice barked orders. The kitchen filled with men who moved like locusts, efficient and hard. Outside, alarms began their wail, a thin, horrifying sound that ran like a needle along the spine of the night. Marcus lay where he had been struck. Ethan checked his pulse with a hand that trembled from more than just the adrenaline. It was faint but steady. Marcus was still alive, but wounded. Ethan made one impossible choice. He left the freezer. He had what they had come for. The hard drive and ledger, even a cache of encrypted videos Marcus had already started copying, were now secure. But Marcus was hurt, and Grace had been taken. Ethan could not carry both the weight of proof and a person out into a squad of hungry men. He shoved a vial of antiseptic and a bandana into his jacket and slung the folded scrap of paper into his pocket. He scooped Marcus like a sack and dragged him into the shadowed corridor toward the loading bay. 2 guards blocked the way. They barked, hands on holsters. Ethan shoved one aside, his shoulders slamming into the other. And somehow momentum favored him. They burst into the alley and into the freezing rain, breath cutting like knives. A delivery van idled near the loading dock as if ordained. Ethan shoved Marcus into the back and slammed the door. The van's driver, a shell of a man who had been told his job was to unload food and ignore the world, glanced at the pair in the rain, then at the badge Marcus wore. "Go!" he hissed, eyes flicking down to the forged manifest on the dashboard. He gunned the engine. As the van pulled through steam and streetlight, Ethan slumped against the metal ribbing and looked at the napkin in his palm. They're poisoning the supply chain. He had proof now, enough to unmake men like Patrick Lane. But Grace's blood had sealed one terrible cost. He felt the burn of helplessness, the keening void of things he could not retrieve. The van threaded out into the street. In the rear view, through the slats of the loading bay, Patrick's silhouette stood in the doorway of the kitchen like a prince of rotting things. He held a phone to his ear and, for a second, lifted his hand in a small, private salute to the empty room. Then he turned away as the doors closed behind the night. Ethan pressed the paper to his lips and read the digits again. 104/17/1998. Grace's birthday, he surmised, and the word server. He tucked the paper into his wallet and felt its outline like a promise. The van sped through neighborhoods, rain slicing the windshield. Marcus was conscious enough to mutter through clenched teeth. "You got it?" he asked, voice a rasp. Ethan looked at the injured man and then at the road ahead. "We got what we came for," he said, "but we lost." He didn't finish the sentence. It would not fit into the hum of the engine or the shiver of fluorescent light. The ledger, the hard drive, the images, they were all real now. They would swing doors open and raise indictments and shine searchlights into boardrooms. They might save strangers in the abstract, but they would never itself undo the brutal torque of what had been done. He thought of Lily's thin lungs, the oxygen concentrator purring softly in a motel room, and of the thin blood-streaked scrap in his pocket. He thought of Grace's eyes, wide and fierce with a courage that had inserted itself into the cogs of his life and refused to leave. Outside, the city moved on. Inside the van, 3 people rode toward a dawn they had not yet earned. Ethan turned the napkin in his hand until the fabric softened, and in the diffuse light he wrapped his fingers around the small folded piece of paper that might, in the cold calculus of systems and servers, be the thing that saved a child. He promised himself, in the way only a man who had lost everything can, that when the morning came, he would not let Grace have died in vain. The news cycle moved like a storm. When Ethan Cole woke that morning in the back of a borrowed van, the city was still gray and cold, but the small rectangle of light from his phone glowed with an urgency that made sleep impossible. Marcus's messages scrolled in rapid succession. Files uploaded to secure encrypted channel. Copies sent to FBI contact. Health department alerted. Cleanworks manifest flagged. PR team on standby but instructed to hold statement until DOJ confirms. A dozen other notes followed. Numbers, times, code words. The ledger, the hard drive, the photos. Marcus had not wasted a minute. Ethan sat in the van as it rolled through neighborhoods that had once felt like solid ground under his feet. Now everything felt fragile as glass. The city had always been good at hiding its rot under pretty facades. He had built businesses that sold people the idea of safety, carefully sourced produce, vetted suppliers, sanitary seals, logos stamped like oaths across menus. The napkin, Grace's napkin, had been the hole that let the light in. They drove straight to the headquarters Ethan rarely visited except for earnings calls, the tile-floored, fluorescent-lit nerve center of Cole International. Marcus had already briefed a small vetted circle. By the time Ethan stepped into the conference room, the room smelled of burnt coffee and adrenaline. Sitting at the table were legal counsel, a trusted few from investor relations, and the one person he trusted for balancing boldness with restraint, Ava Whitaker, his head of corporate social responsibility. "We need to move carefully," Ava said immediately, the sentence a scalpel. "If we leak wrong, we provoke cover-ups. If we wait too long, someone, Patrick, his associates, it destroys evidence. We have to thread the needle." Ethan slid the hard drive and a photocopy of the ledger across the table. "We don't have time to thread anything. We have the server logs, invoices, video clips of threats. Take it to Marcus's contact at the FBI now. He told me last night to be ready. Don't spin it. Give them the files and let them do their job." They did. The files moved like a pulse through channels no ordinary person sees. Secure servers, encrypted transfers, protocol codes that triggered a chain reaction. The Department of Justice took jurisdiction. The Health Department dispatched field investigators. Within hours, federal agents in plain clothes were at the Monarch table. pairing the ledger with lab results that showed bacterial contamination patterns consistent with the old Westfield scandal. Evidence matched across accounts: shell companies, backdated invoices, coded transfers to an offshore account that suddenly cleared the same night a shipment had arrived. Patrick Lane did not have long to pretend ignorance. At 11:30 a.m., two unmarked SUVs rolled up to the restaurant. Agents moved with the economy of rehearsed motion hands at vests, eyes sharp, cameras ready. The dining room emptied under the hush of stunned curiosity. Patrick was sitting in his office when plainclothes agents entered, and for a long, thin, suspended second, he looked exactly what he was: a man who had practiced being untouchable so long that the touch surprised him like heat. "You are under arrest," an agent said simply. Patrick's face drained the color from it. The crystal paperweight gleamed stupidly in the sudden light as he was led away, cuffs flashing like punctuation. In the kitchen, staff whispered like a passing wind. The ledger, which had once looked innocuous in a safe, now sat in evidence bags and under the scrutiny of men whose jobs were to parse everyday sin into crime. But the arrests were not the end. They were the start of a larger awake. The FBI's public statement was careful but devastating. Preliminary investigation indicates systematic adulteration of supply chain and deliberate mislabeling of food served to customers. Indictments expected. The health department placed immediate holds on distribution for multiple suppliers, and the state attorney general announced a coordinated investigation into food safety practices across the industry. Headlines followed. The story leapt from local papers to national networks with the avarice of gossip. Ethan watched it all with a numbness that felt like a physical thing, an ache that sat under his ribs. There were press vans outside the Monarch table, pundits parsing the scandal on live TV, and voices, some furious, some calling for reform, clamoring for accountability. But for Ethan, the public spectacle only skirted the true price. He had expected legal battles, fallout, maybe even the slow restructuring of supply chains. He had not expected the human toll to feel so close, so elemental. They found Grace's body that afternoon. It was not in any place you could imagine and forgive. It was under a bridge near the old port, a place where the tides bring things washed ashore, and people go when they think no one is watching. A dockhand had noticed a bundle snagged against a piling and called it in. The coroner's preliminary report was clinical and terrible. Blunt force trauma, evidence of restraint, and a time of death that matched the chaotic window during Ethan's break-in. Her fingertips were curled around something folded in paper, Grace's napkin, the same linen that had changed everything, now stained with the rust brown of a life extinguished. When Ethan first heard, the world telescoped down to a point. He was standing in a press room where the cameras were bright and the lawyers were talking logistics. Words bounced off and slid by. Someone's voice, Marcus's, cut through, as if from far away. They found her. He remembers the walking, or what looked like walking. He remembers a siren on the other side of himself. He remembers the hotel hallway, the click of his shoes, the pressure behind his eyes that felt like liquid. He remembers seeing Lily on a small hospital bed later that day, the child's breath a fragile metronome, the skin pallid as paper, the oxygen tubing curved like a halo. A nurse soft and direct handed him a chart with her name and diagnosis. Ethan's fingers closed on it until he left crescent marks in the paper. At the vigil the community organized 2 nights later, hundreds came. There were flowers, candles, and people whose names Ethan did not know, servers from other restaurants, neighbors, people who had never met Grace but had heard the story like a bell. They gathered under a rain that would not let up, their faces upturned against the wet, their breath visible as clouds. Grace's sister Lily, smaller than the child in the hospital, stood wrapped in a blanket with an aunt who cradled her like a harbor. A woman from the kitchen spoke about a girl who had stayed late to cover a coworker, who mailed part of her tips to her sister, who had always carried a brave face like a single polished coin. Ethan read through the notes Grace had smuggled into his life. The napkin, the folded scrap with her login info, the ledger's photographed pages. He had watched the video footage of Patrick's threats in the safe. He had held evidence that could dismantle networks. In the candlelight, among strangers and the grieving, He felt an emptiness that hunger and money could not touch. He had asked himself 1,000 strategic questions in the quiet hours. Did I cause this by waiting? Could I have saved her if I'd come sooner? Those questions had no satisfying answers. They were knives. There were lawsuits, of course. There were settlements and criminal charges and televised testimony. Under oath, employees described the pattern that had become normal. The cheap cuts routed through shell companies, the sanitization of reports, the pressure to hit impossible margins. Patrick, in his booking photograph, looked smaller than in reality. Suddenly, all the arrogance scraped away. In depositions, a frightened kitchen worker detailed the night they'd brought in crates without proper labeling, the manager's impatience to get food on plates, the clip's suggestions to turn down the lab results. A consultant from the health department testified to the trails of bacterial cultures that matched archived samples from the old Westfield scandal. Violations that had once been invisible now had names and dates. Coded transactions led like fingerprints to accounts that could not be explained away. But the government's gears grind slowly. The first victories are administrative licenses revoked, fines levied, temporary shutdowns that sting reputations more than operations. Those are necessary, but they are not consolation. Grace's death was a moral epicenter that the legal system could circle but not heal. Ethan understood the limits of restitution. He could not return the sound of Grace's laugh on a busy lunch shift. He could not take back the fear that papered her face during her last hours. Money could fix hospitals' invoices and cure treatment plans, but it could not stitch the small, invisible web of trust that Grace had cut across his life by writing a few trembling words on a napkin. He stood in the hospital hallway outside Lily's room and filled forms with his full name and corporate information. A social worker arrived, efficient and human. She explained the financial options and introduced a pediatric hematologist who used clinical language that was both hopeful and cautious. Ethan wrote checks that were not checks, arrangements instead of IOUs, long-term medical funds, guaranteed payments, access to specialists in other states. He authorized genetic testing, compassionate drug programs, a transfer to a specialized facility if needed. He arranged for a nurse to come daily. He called in favors across the medical world he had only ever read about, and people who owed him favors, people who did not ask for gratitude answered. When Lily's treatment began, it was not a miracle, but a sequence of micro-rescues, a rare drug chartered from a trial, an immunosuppressant protocol secured through a previous connection, a bed in a pediatric unit with specialized technicians. Lily's prognosis was tentative and complicated and entirely redeemed from where it had been. She ticked through lab values and IV drips and then slowly, stubbornly improved. Each oxygenation level that rose felt like a small victory scored against the dark. Grief, however, does not submit to ledger entries. At Grace's memorial, small, private, and raw, Ethan met the family for the first time. Her mother's voice had an edge that was equal parts anger and exhaustion. She did what she thought was right, her aunt said simply, and the clarity of that sentence knocked the wind out of Ethan. The funeral was Wednesday, and the city had been polite with its sorrow. He had not practiced words for this. He could not find an elegy in his chest among the thickenings of regret. He placed a hand in intrusion, perhaps on Lily's small shoulder at the reception, and promised a fatherless promise in the only currency he now trusted: action. Ethan created a fund that very week, the Grace Miller Foundation for Food Integrity. He drafted it with legal counsel and a moralist fervor. The fund would do three things: pay for Lily's ongoing medical care, support employees and families harmed by corporate negligence, and finance third-party audits and whistleblower protections in the hospitality industry. He did not want the foundation to be a PR band-aid that later executives would point to as proof of contrition. He made it irrevocable with endowments, independent trustees, and a charter that prevented corporate interference. If he could not bring Grace back, he could at least ensure that the mechanism which had allowed her death could be dismantled, and that anyone with the courage to speak would have legal, financial, and personal scaffolding to fall back on. He also demanded accountability inside his companies. Dozens were questioned. Senior managers who had turned blind eyes were suspended pending investigation. Contracts with questionable suppliers were shredded and reopened to competitive, vetted bidding. Coal International brought in an outside compliance firm to audit every link in the supply chain, from slaughterhouses to plate. The firm's recommendations were rigorous and costly. 24/7 testing protocols, blockchain-backed provenance tracking, and an employee hotline answered by a third-party agency that guaranteed anonymity. There were consequences far beyond legal compliance. The industry took notice. Trade groups re-examined self-regulatory models. A string of congressional hearings discussed the ease of laundering product through shell companies. Food safety watchdogs gained funding. Patrick Lane's indictment became a symbol, not the only culprit, but a node in a wider network of negligence and greed. Executives in other firms began, for PR or genuine fear, to overhaul practices. That the public attention existed meant something. That attention cost some men their jobs. That aftermath also did not bring back grace. Months later, in a small downtown courtroom, Patrick stood trial. The footage from the safe, his threats, his deals, the notebook with instructions on how to hide test results played across screens like a confession. He tried to blame rogue subcontractors and systemic neglect, but the ledger and the call logs tethered to his phone mapped a path of deliberate choices. The jury deliberated for less than a day. The verdict, guilty on multiple counts, conspiracy to defraud, tampering with public health records, and manslaughter in the second degree for reckless endangerment leading to death. Sentencing would come later, but his life as he had cultivated it was unmade. The criminal justice system had done its job in one narrow vital sense. It had named wrongdoing and punished perpetrators, and it had, too, underscored the fragility of accountability when it depends on whistleblowers whose lives and bodies are used as collateral for truth. Grace's name became a headline, then an echo, then a banner for safe food initiatives. Her napkin, the original artifact, was enclosed in a frame at the Foundation's modest first office, a reminder that courage can be small and paper thin and still ignite reform. Ethan did not find catharsis in the verdict. He found a shadow of it in Lily's small smile the week after the trial, sitting at a window with the sun soft on her face as she painted in watercolor. The doctors were guardedly optimistic. The aggressive regimen had taken effect. Vital signs that had once been precarious now convened into a pattern that spelled survival. Lily had a future, uncertain and bright, and the sensation of that possibility felt like the closest thing to redemption Ethan dared to consider. On the Foundation's first anniversary, Ethan arranged a public forum on food integrity that he had intended to be a simple, practical affair, presentations by scientists, panels by regulators, and a workshop for small restaurant owners about safe procurement practices. Instead, it became something else, a citywide conversation. Chefs who had once minimized costs for profit now spoke about stewardship. Former managers who had lost their jobs in the sweep acknowledged their role and pledged cooperation. There were families there whose names he could not recall, but whose faces he would never forget. The mother of a boy who had been hospitalized after a bad batch of chicken, the father of a woman who had died in a care facility where staff ignored safety protocols. It was messy, human, and real. That night, when the forum ended and the chairs were stacked and the projector slept, Ethan returned to the Monarch table. The dining room had been refurbished in the wake of the scandal. New paint, new carpeting, more stringent supplier contracts pinned up by the doors as certificates of compliance. The public was reassured every few inches by plaques. Ethan sat at the same corner table near the kitchen, the one with a view of the swinging service doors. He unfolded his coat and took from his pocket the linen napkin that had been the catalyst, clean now, conservatively washed and framed, but never immaculate. He had kept the scrap paper Grace had given him too, the single line with the login and the birth date. Those were small bones of the story, the proof and the ledger and the human hand that had placed them both into the world. He unfolded a new linen napkin, one his staff had embroidered in secret. Across the bottom, in small, careful gold thread, the words, "She told the truth." He placed it on the table like a benediction and then sat back. The kitchen doors opened and closed, and a line cook passed through with a tray. Ethan watched the movement, a choreography he had once orchestrated and now only observed. He thought of the life that had once been his normal meetings, deals, launches, shareholder calls, and understood something he had eluded for years. Power without moral vigilance is just a scaffold for harm. Money, he now believed, is a tool and not an answer. Influence is an obligation and not an entitlement. Outside, the city moved on under its own indifferent laws. Inside, a kid from a motel bed reached out from a hospital cot to grasp for oxygen and hope. It was not a tidy world. There were no tidy endings. Grace's death had opened a wound that would never fully close. But it had also, brutally and irrevocably, changed him. He rose and walked to the small service window, where a line cook met his gaze. The young man, calloused hands, a face freckled with flour and sweat, looked at Ethan with a mixture of curiosity and the guarded respect that comes when power chooses presence over distance. "Make sure they test every batch," Ethan said simply. "No shortcuts. If you see something, say something. We will listen." The cook nodded uncertainly, then walked back into the clatter and hiss. Ethan folded the embroidered napkin and held it for a long moment. Then he left the restaurant and walked into the cold San Francisco air. He had built an empire of taste and convenience, and now he would spend the rest of his life trying to rebuild trust. It would not be enough. It would never be enough for those who had been hurt, but it was something he could do with the rest of the power he had been given. At his penthouse that night, before he closed his eyes, Ethan opened a small wooden box and placed Grace's napkin beside the embroidered one. He laid his hand across both linens until he felt the faint texture of both, the roughness of a life lived on the edge and the soft promise of repair. He whispered, though he did not know who he was speaking to, "I will not let this be the only thing you did that mattered." Outside, the city lights blinked on, indifferent and innumerable. Inside, Ethan Cole began the slow, stubborn work of turning truth into something more than pain, into policy, into protection, into a small scaffolding for lives like Lily's to stand on. Truth had cost blood, but it had also finally demanded reform. Sometimes truth costs more than life itself. If this story of courage and sacrifice touched you, hit like so more people can hear it. Subscribe because tomorrow's story will shake your heart even deeper. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Let's see how far this story of truth can reach.